uh, Benjamin or Ben, whichever you prefer. It's your first time here, so maybe
Yeah,
intros, and then maybe Z and I can also introduce ourselves real quick. Victor, if you're here, feel free.
for sure. Yeah, Z actually invited me to join this call a couple of months ago. I did a project with Block Science probably just over 3 years ago now, before founding my own company called CAD Labs, where we do software modeling and simulation of crypto financial systems. And also have done a little bit of education about using one of the tools at Block Science, open sourced, called CAD. Yeah, so it's great to join you guys here. Interested to hear what you'll be discussing.
Fantastic. So you already know everyone here, and well, except for Eric, who's already introduced himself and myself, and I'm a boring person who works at NumFocus. So good to go. Yeah. So Z, unless you have an intro you want for the recording, we can throw it right over to Eric.
I
Eric
will
and
yield to GPT Eric.
right, Eric, the floor is yours.
All right. So the talk is about the economics of data, but as I alluded in our sort of pre-recording intros, to me, the rallying cry of institutional economists is it's very hard to explain observed economic performance across units of comparison absent taking the rules of the game into account. And so this is this talk is drawn pretty heavily from the insights of four of my favorite economics scholars. And for those of you who pay attention to economics Nobels, they were just awarded to Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, other institutional thinkers. And the guy in the lower left is Douglas North, and he's kind of at the macro level known for making the point institutions matter for explaining observed economic performance, especially between countries and across time. And so abstracting away from the rules of the game is often insufficient via formal modeling of economic systems to understand comparative performance unless the units under comparison are subject to exactly the same institutional set. And it turns out that's relatively rare in practice. The other thinkers, kind of going up, James Buchanan, known for public choice and a often construed as dismal take on the extent to which we get good policy. His take was policy is fundamentally a function of people's beliefs, interests, and preferences, such that there is no single uniform right answer for most hard policy decisions. And this also leads to very mechanical sort of structural forces that preference small concentrated interest groups in democratic systems relative to the larger sort of mass of the constituents as a whole. That's called public choice theory for those following along. Coase is known for, on the upper right, for arguing both about the emergence of firms, but also the persistent presence of transaction costs as determining outcomes. So many ideal outcomes seem attainable if you assume away transaction costs, but in a world of positive transaction costs, things are quite sticky, including institutional equilibria. Finally, in the lower right, Oliver Williamson was known for taking on kind of the dominant mantra of his time, which was any form of non-standard contracting or organizational forms must reflect market manipulation or abuse of market power. And he was like, no, actually, organizations are highly tailored, and the contracts that make up those organizations are also highly tailored to the specific animating purposes or productive output that an organization is pursuing. And so these are kind of four thinkers whose thoughts are central to my following exposition. But I sat down and kind of was like, what is central to my view about a lot of the governance challenges we're seeing with the very, productive and transformative uses of data that are occurring? And the first is simply economies of scale. Increasing returns to scale or constant returns to scale mean that you need massive organizations to pursue that output at an economically efficient level. And I think data sets are very much subject to this kind of caveat, which is not in all instances. I'm not like every last data set needs to be massive. I think that there are many very interesting, nimble, very specialized, smaller data sets out there that are, curated by a much smaller organization necessarily. But that being said, I think as we're seeing with LLMs in particular, the more data you can give them, all else equal, the better they perform. That's a ceteris paribus argument, which is, I think it's very interesting to think through things like synthetic data, as well as I follow someone on Twitter, Brian Romilly, who is like the information we're training LLMs on currently is pretty poor. And so naturally, we're going to get poorer performance if we curate the data set to be, all of the Reddit posts in existence, or worse, even all of the 4chan posts in existence. It's like an LLM bot trained on that. Maybe, maybe not, but all else equal, I do think that there are massive economies of scale here, which means the entities, assembling and, creating downstream products from these massive data sets are themselves likely to be quite large. Think Meta, think Alphabet, think Amazon. All of those platform intermediaries, they are benefiting, as are their consumers on some margins at least, from massive economies of scale in the collection, aggregation, and sort of ultimate use of data. However, this stuff gets pretty technical pretty quickly. And so I also think that the people engaged in massive data collection are highly specialized. It requires a technical skill set that probably most of you on this call outstrip me when it comes to. And so there are benefits to housing a bunch of very, very pricey data engineers in one company, such as Google, to take just but one example. And so ultimately, there are massive economies of specialization undergirding these systems. Finally, I mean, how many of you enjoy the cookies consent pages that you're confronted with now, thanks to the European intervention for the privacy rights of consumers? Are those protecting your privacy effectively? Maybe if you actually, curate most of them at a very tailored level. That being said, though, I use Brave browser for most things. And I think there are actually interesting privacy solutions that have nothing to do with the enforced regulatory interventions that we're seeing a lot more of out of the EU. And to be clear, I'm skeptical about the benefits of some of these regulatory interventions to protect, against certain data abuses. But I do get annoyed by people, especially in the crypto ecosystem, where they're like, we can just claim we're not subject to regulation, and that will be the case. And so I actually think the constraints of the environment is we're about to see a lot more regulation of data governance by public governments. And therefore, I view the EU as well as the state of California as good bellwethers for the likely trajectory we're heading, whether or not that's a super effective place to be heading. And so, to me, another economist maxim that I view as essential to understanding some of the data governance dilemmas in practice is it's known as there's no such thing as a free lunch, where it's all about trade-offs in pursuit of a particular objective that define the success or failure of a given private organization. And so all important decisions will be ones that confront these trade-offs. You might be thinking in your head, what about those, screamingly obvious right decisions for a given organization collecting data? And I'm like, cherish those. They're pretty rare. And basically, the essence of governance of any private organization is about navigating these trade-offs. Finally, a few more concepts. Most of these are contributions from, fields criticizing economics originally, whether it be law and economics or complexity theory or kind of information theory as a function of assessing the decisions of a welfare maximizing individual agent in a given model. But incomplete contracts say we can't foresee all downstream contingencies relevant to performing complex contracts between commercial parties in, most large modern economies at scale. Nighty and uncertainty is a generalization of exactly that reality as applied to contracts, which is unknown unknowns. We can't foresee that which we cannot foresee, and whether or not that articulation of that reality is tautological, that omnipresent reality is very important for understanding my view of how we govern complex economic systems. Finally, those within these systems are acting under imperfect information when they make decisions, and therefore a purely rational decision is often not the one undertaken, because modeling purely rational decisions tends to assume perfect information as compared to a bounded information set, an incomplete information set, or one governed by considerable uncertainty. So, to me, this leads to certain kind of, ultimately, I would say, mechanical forces defining the economics of data in the digital realm that's all around us and transforming in exciting ways by the day. But economies of scale beget massive organizations. And to me, this is, a lot of people are like, should we break up companies? And to me, you're introducing transaction costs at a minimum between different organizations, and you're limiting the purchase of your data sets in furtherance of all the exciting objectives that I see novel uses of data being applied to in real time. And so I'm not in the camp that thinks breaking up the big tech giants is an answer to this problem. But I also think that there are potential problems lurking here. So I'm not somebody who's like, just let the tech giants do whatever they want, wherever they want, whenever they want, Economies of specialization mean, how do you know Google is faithfully using your data in ways that are consistent with your preferences? How would you even go about assessing that? My argument is, there are acute monitoring difficulties associated with how specialized and technical a lot of the most transformative uses of data in the modern era are. And this also is a limitation to which regulatory interventions are subject, which is, the prior intervention that was viewed as a massive success for EU's antitrust authorities was that of, well, how many of you use Internet Explorer? Oh, wait, Microsoft Edge. That's what it's called now, for those of you that weren't especially familiar with that weird reality. But come around the turn of the millennia, boy, were the EU authorities concerned about the market power of Microsoft in particular. So what did they do? They said, you have to load onto an operating system that's currently dominant, Microsoft Office. You have to load competing browsers. You're forced to give them market share, if you will. This form of intervention has not gone away, just in the sense that that's a prelude to something I'll be previewing in terms of the EU's current intended interventions into data markets. But to me, monitoring difficulties are very much derivative of the economies of specialization that characterize data markets. Finally, attention economies. To me, it is a good thing that we don't have to pay attention to every last process that influences outcomes for us. I view this as fundamentally a positive, in the sense that it implies that we have processes that are working in furtherance of outcomes that are valuable to us, that don't require all of our constant attention in every moment. What's the example I give to my finance students? My diversified retirement portfolio is invested with numerous people across, numerous different international countries, numerous municipalities, numerous private companies. I can't even know the names of all of the people involved in ensuring my retirement, let alone those directly responsible for monitoring them. And so for me, we get a lot more when we don't have to pay attention to every last downstream outcome affecting us. And this reality has operated greatly to the detriment of DAOs in practice. Make no mistake. And so we tend to see some people making decisions on behalf of a much larger group. That's called delegated representation. Whether it's managers within corporate structures, whether it's, your politicians that are exercising decision rights on the behalf of the constituents that elected them, you name it, but this is emergent within human organizations above a certain scale. But guess what comes along with that? Do each of you feel ideally represented by your particular politician representing your district? I doubt it. And the more we poll people, the more it's revealed that there are agency costs associated with these realities. And to me, the fact that there's no such thing as a free lunch means trade-offs abound, including in these contexts, as we'll see with a few of the regulatory interventions that the EU is engaging in. But finally, these realities, the incompleteness of our information, which begets the incompleteness of our institutions, as shocked by that which we could not foresee in a particular moment, that means we've got conflict in any organization above a certain scale, because you scale an organization large enough, and that means its members are heterogeneous. They're there for slightly to significantly different reasons, and that means their preferences, interests, and beliefs about how the organization should respond or make any decision to change its practices or to change its outputs means that those decisions will be ones that provoke conflict. This also means at a fundamental level, and I make a kind of long-winded version of this argument in the introduction to an institutions and complexity handbook that I'm co-editing currently, is that governance just won't go away. It's something that we need present in human organizations above a certain scale because of the axiomatic presence of the incompleteness of our information as confronting the messiness of this complex reality. And so here's a couple just kind of, I recently gave this a portion of this talk starting now to a group of 50 to 60 state and federal judges, and basically was showing them that, like, wow, you should be aware of these issues because they are coming down the pike at you in real time. But an intervention predicated on concerns surrounding market power said, hey, firms serving EU customers, namely Google is the target of this particular regulation, must share ranking, query, click, and view data with third-party search engines. So DuckDuckGo is a big winner as a result of this intervention. But such shared data must ensure personal data is anonymized. So Google, in response, is creating a new program where other search engines can obtain a data set containing more than 1 billion distinct queries from people each quarter. Query plus results presented, views, and clicks creates a quarterly data set with about 53 billion rows of information. But this is where the big trade-off comes from, is if a query is rare enough, has mapped to country and URL data, that can expose a lot more data than one might think. And so Google is slicing off all of its rarest queries to preserve the potential, or to preserve the identity due to privacy concerns of those making unconventional queries. What are the benefits of this from the EU regulators' perspective? Third-party search competitors, and I think from their hope, companies located within those countries or located within the EU become actual meaningful competitors to Google. But the usefulness of this data is curtailed as anonymization increases. No linkages between queries and location and views/clicks much less value to third parties. So interestingly, stringent privacy requirements can operate to the benefit of large incumbents. And are third-party search engines truly acting in the interests of users here? People didn't opt into their data being shared with these third-party search engines. You'll have to excuse me for one moment. Too much coffee, so I have to run to the restroom, but I'll be back in but a moment. Very sorry.
We can stall for a second if you guys want to chat about the sort of transition from the institutional economics background into the practical data economics stuff, if anybody's interested, while we wait for Eric. Did you at least find the background helpful, sort of collecting data for future presentations, doing a kind of theory background before getting into the specifics?
Yeah, I found the presentation really well done. I obviously don't have a background in these sort of topics, but it's been very interesting.
Cool. Sorry, I'm like space filling. I've found the experience with the data trust to be very, very much more bound up in the kind of the legal regulations, even just like really basic operational stuff, than the sort of markets for data. When we first started working on it a couple of years ago, like a lot of our expectations were a little bit more like markets as the mechanisms that would drive the use cases. But it turned out that, like, you know, as long as you're doing something that is in a kind of nebulous regulatory environment, or at least or even just a conflicting one where things are changing and they're diverse in terms of the like, for example, the laws in the EU and the US are different. The laws in California are different from the ones in New York, and so on. The moment that you're dealing with an internet-based phenomena that has a footprint in an undetermined, like at least in advance undetermined kind of regulatory landscape, the extent to which you can design for anything other than just like survival in the face of that diverse and changing regulatory landscape approximates zero. Like, you no matter how many cool ideas you have about markets or kind of structures that might facilitate sense making in with data, you get stuck because your like backstop to the legal frameworks is muddled. And I think that's part of the reason why we see so many people, at least in the Web3 world, trying to just say, hey, that doesn't apply to us. On one hand, I think that's ridiculous. To Eric's point, it obviously does. But on the other hand, there's an incentive to do that, because in a lot of cases, the regulations, at least, you know, when you union them up across all of the landscapes, and you look at the fact that they're changing, are basically unsolvable. So I think sometimes people use that as a way to just try to do anything at all. And Eric's back. You've probably heard the tail end of what I said, if you want to riff on it before you dive back in.
No, two things immediately come to mind. One being, it's not to say that the ethos of, I'm very pro innovation. And so I do like a piece by Adam Thierer about permissionless innovation, as well as his surveys of the techno panics that he calls them as new technologies have emerged. And I mean, at the advent of the railroad, you had a bunch of scientists arguing that the human body was not intended to go at those speeds, and that terrible, terrible things would happen if people systematically journeyed at those speeds. I'm glad they're not correct, because boy, do I take a lot of international flights at, you know, speeds that are certainly radically exceeding those. But that has a deeper point, which is often in new technology and populist contexts, regulation gets it wrong, is kind of the take from two institutional scholars doing a meta-analysis, one of whom I had as a professor when I was at University of Maryland getting my econ degree. And ultimately, what's interesting is increasingly technology itself becomes an issue for technological, like populist issues are also new technology. And so ultimately, you're seeing both sides of this current presidential debate lean against the big tech companies because they're not especially popular in these moments when it comes to speech control on the one side, when it comes to market power abuses and privacy on the other. Each side is equally concerned about the excess of power, and they're flogging certain populist sentiments to further their, regulatory objectives. But that makes a nice segue to my next slide, which is these were some companies over the course of the last year with whom the FTC settled. So Avast says, hey, we're antivirus software and privacy enhancing browser extension, except we're actually collecting all of your website visits. And so the FTC got a hold of their data, and a random sample out of 100 out of trillions of data points had people's queries about health information, political activities, tax status, employment status, financial aid applications, directions from point A to point B, things about their children, things about their dating life, and things about their sexual preferences. They randomly grabbed 100, and it contained at least one query pertaining to each of those questions. And so generally, and the judges I presented this to at greater length with some of the sort of pending regulatory and other legal issues that data collection poses, they were all like, a lot of them, except for ones that have already been overseeing cases. So I had a federal judge from New York come up to me after the talk, and he was like, really glad you gave this for all of my fellow judges because they don't know what's coming down the pike at them. I'm overseeing a case right now that gets into this at a very complex level. He's like, and I can't tell you anything more about it, but he's like, wow, is this underappreciated among those who are about to be adjudicating cases pertaining to exactly these questions. And then another geolocation data aggregator sold location data to government contractors without notification or permission. And another such aggregator sorted people into specific groups for targeted advertisement. I felt like I'm above the median income in our country, at least. And, I'm like, am I wealthy and not healthy? Because they were targeting some groups for different, and it was like religious, but placing people into buckets for targeted advertising was the entirety of their model. Another one advertised how geolocation data was accurate to within 20 meters or less and could be linked to other persistent identifiers that could be used to identify people personally using public information or other data brokers' information. And so repeated aggregation and kind of synthesis of plausible inferences about people, their identity or their preferences is another very interesting question lurking here. Mind you, none of these data sets contain names, social security numbers, or the like, but if they're available on an open market and somebody is out there on the dark web, I wonder how much matching they could actually do with names and social security numbers as a function of address, place of employment, or other things that are in these aggregated data sets. Another big issue that
I want to throw in a concrete, I just wrote it in the chat, but like so I worked in ad tech for a little while, and I knew a lot of people in that industry, and like I knew one person who maybe not the best example, like from a things are good, but like they could get to the point where they could like target the dynamic billboards on people's commutes to work. And this was with like gray market data. So I would consider it gray market data if you're in the realm where people are doing these data aggregation, sometimes multi-hop aggregation and enrichment workflows on data that is like, let's call it like questionably sourced. It's not that it's like necessarily illegal, but it's also not obviously legal. And there's at least, these these kinds of markets are the reason for all of this regulatory intervention, is that the amount of that kind of economic activity had been growing steadily, and it was mostly driven, at least from my experience, by the ad tech industry, and that there was some pretty crazy stuff that people could do, even with data that was ostensibly anonymized. And so the example of like targeting the billboard on somebody's drive to work is getting pretty creepy.
Yeah, and it imagine that level of targeting coupled with knowledge of your finances, also then mapped to a company's pricing strategy tailored down to you as the individual buyer. And I'm also like, I'm enough of a fan of markets that I'm like, generally if people have an ability to return something and they purchase it at a given price, they wanted it more than the price at which they purchased it. And so I'm not like we should ban Uber's surge pricing. That being said, are we okay with dynamic pricing that's hyper targeted as a function of our individual characteristics? And in all cases, in all contexts. And so the example I used to motivate the judges was, I was like, I'm going to give you something cute, spicy, and scary. The cute was pictures of my cats to describe the fact that I might be inclined, after a few glasses of wine, to buy them a $300 cat lounger on Amazon. Amazon, knowing when I tend to make the big 3-figure purchases on their website, manages to target me at the right time, and maybe they're charging me 40% more for the cat lounger than it would have been if I'd searched it myself. The spicy thing was I got targeted for very high-end margaritas as I was flying into Las Vegas. I'm like, I would have gone to get those margaritas if I wasn't here with my wife and daughter. But the scary thing was I got the US Marshals permission, but I took a photo of the bathroom that we were all using at this event for judges and was like, that has geolocation data on it. If I had emailed it to myself, Google would have harvested that geolocation data. If I had been stupid enough to post it on my socials saying, look at this schwa 4 Seasons that I'm staying at with these judges, people would plausibly know exactly where the judges were at specific moments in time associated with the public schedule of this event. And so gambling, if any of you saw the Wall Street Journal expose, using algorithms to determine when a gambler was trying to quit from a gambling website, a friendly sales agent would contact them and say, hey, I know you're having financial trouble, so I just topped up your account with another $200 of promotional credits to keep you gambling. And so to me, the level of ability to target pricing has certainly come up in this presidential election in terms of electronic price tags at grocery stores. A lot of different candidates on the left were very concerned about the use of that to potentially target people. The stores are like, hey, we're actually using this so that we can we can get lower prices to consumers, but how are we going to prove that? And the point I used to my students was, how would you feel about your local liquor store charging more between the hours that the CU students are most likely to come in there? Beer's 40% more expensive between the hours of 6:30 and 10:30 p.m. I'm like, just buy it in a different time. But this level of data enables a level of price discrimination, as it's often called, in ways that many people find deeply concerning. And so there are going to be regulatory solutions. One big proposal that's out there in the legal scholarship is that of imposing fiduciary standards onto platforms and other data intermediaries. These scholars argue that duties to contributors, data contributors that is, could be compatible with duties to shareholders. The more they're needed, the more value their imposition or assumption could provide to companies in this space. But a criticism coming from other legal scholars, including the current head of the FTC, is, do fiduciary duties do well with conflict between duties? So you've got a duty to your data contributors and you've got a duty to your shareholders, and less data privacy means more money for your shareholders. Do platforms even have the expertise to faithfully adhere to specialized duties? And I mean, in responding to the FTC, most major platforms said they couldn't identify the provenance of all of the data that they were using. Does the average platform user, given the economies of specialization and the high level of technical expertise required to assess them, does the average platform user even have the ability to give informed consent? So unsurprisingly, coming from the future head of the FTC, their argument was this is a market power problem, not an incentive alignment problem. However, I take a somewhat dim view of either of those approaches, notwithstanding their inevitability, as being the sort of ideal solution. And so in particular, there's a long-standing presence in highly technical, massively scaled markets of specialized independent private organizations. Consultants, auditors, and trusts are long-standing organizations playing important roles in a variety of markets. So to me, the familiarity of these entities suggests that it probably can't all be in-house. That's what the imposition of a fiduciary standard would try to create. The threat of downstream liability means the major platforms are induced to act on behalf of data contributors. But to me, do our regulators always get it right? Think of the cookie consent clicks. And I hope somebody's done a study estimating the amount of man hours that go around the world annually to the cookie consent, even if it's just accept all, let alone the people that are actually tailoring all of those little toggles. It's like, I wonder what we could have built with the man hours that now go as a result of that particular regulatory intervention. And I understand their concern. I don't like the level of targeted tracking that's occurring. But guess what? I use a browser that prevents me from doing so. Even as certain major websites, and this is why I'm like, market power is a non-zero concern here, even as I'm a little bit skeptical of the wisdom of the intervention or that the form our interventions will take. Why? Why do I think market power is present? The websites that don't work on Brave browser correspond almost perfectly to things that are massive. Like, effectively, United, Bank of America, Amazon. Some of those work, but a lot of them do not on Brave browser, or they make my life miserable getting them to work. Because they're like, you're doing something that's cutting off our cookies, and we want to make your life miserable or not provide you our service at all. And so, as Zargham alluded to, and this is a good place to leave it, I view special purpose organizations as part emergent within this ecosystem. Boy, are auditing companies and security firms having a field day in Web3 contexts. Rightly so. How do I verify whether a smart contract actually will do what it says it does? That is still an issue of trust, notwithstanding how much this sort of, crypto advocates are like, you don't need trust. And I'm like, yeah, if you can read the code base of a particular blockchain network, maybe not. But until then, seems like you're trusting a lot. And so Zargham and I helped to design a special purpose trust in Guernsey, empowered to represent data contributors against third parties. So the trust monitors users, revenue, security, and privacy, and importantly has what we call a circuit breaker authority to batch revoke member data contributor consent from third parties that it doesn't feel like are playing fairly with them. And so that is deliberately modeled after the general strike function of unions and is thought to align incentives more productively. And we've spun out of that now a labs that is a one-stop compliance shop and auditor for companies' data practices surrounding their compliance with existing and increasingly proliferating data regulations. There's also algorithmic auditors like Orca, as well as a friend of ours, Isaac Patka. He has Shield 3, I think it's called. And so ultimately, I think that there's huge business opportunities here. And as a kind of final concluding note, I do think this is why I'm so interested in blockchain networks in particular, which is we can't plausibly have real-time monitoring of all downstream uses of data being, pursued by all of these massive platforms. That creates a need to trust them that they are complying. Our regulators will find egregious examples of misconduct. But to me, a talk I'm about to give in Australia is entitled Digital Constitutionalism. Rights are only as good as their enforcers. I've recently become interested in zero-knowledge proofs. And so if you put a piece of information or submit an action to a zero-knowledge proof circuit, the output of that circuit will show whether or not the circuit was successfully run. My concern, though, is you show to a regulator that your company has a zero-knowledge technology installed in some level of its activities with data. How do you know that that is always taking place? And so what fascinates me about blockchain networks is their ability to prove reliable execution of certain digital processes occurring thereupon. I think that that is a general purpose sort of benefit. And granted, you may not need full ledger distribution in order to obtain that outcome. For certain linear data processes, timestamping in blocks the information created is a form of tamper-proofness that I think will be increasingly important in private and public sector contexts alike. But the sort of quintessential refrain of who watches the watchman is, to me, and ultimately one that we should be taking very seriously, because otherwise we're going to have to trust these intermediaries or trust the imperfect regulators, or hope for the emergence of these auditing functions, which I think are going to increasingly proliferate. If I had more technical knowledge, I would spin up an auditing company in a specialized area, expecting Ernst & Young to buy it for an insane amount of money in 5 years. That's all I got. Look forward to chatting, and sorry for taking so much time.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. I'm having to plug my phone or my computer in, so give me a second. There we go. So it doesn't crash on me. I thought that was great and productive. We have probably about 10 minutes for discussion. I think just to kind of like refer to that last bit around the technologies and trust, I think there's just like an important recognition that, tools can get us so far and they can help us restructure who gets trusted for what and like how these systems get architected, but they don't actually eliminate that, right? So the ability to say, okay, this sort of system asserts or guarantees the following, well, we know in practice alone, then people will find ways to exploit that. If I can prove this, this, and that, then I will optimize, within the scope of that guarantee in order to get like higher level systems to behave consistently despite those uncertainties and those incompletenesses. You kind of architect them into quote systems, right, where the inputs of some systems are outputs of others and so on. And then you can get like more reliable and aggregate systems, but in the process you lose legibility. And I think we're in a place now with our data economies where we're long past the legibility. It's very difficult to understand what's going on. So there are real benefits to increasing legibility. But if we approach that in a direction that is too big of a thrash, then we get these things that are, in a sense, how would I say, like where the attention costs go through the roof. And so, recognizing that the economic configuration for data economies is pretty bad. It's inefficient on attention. It supports lots of market power. The regulations are not clearly effective or likely to drive their own intents, but they sound good, which is what seems to be driving them. I'm of the opinion that, there needs to be some actual practical inquiries into alternative architectures, and the superset work is an example where, probing the space with research on both theoretical and on the ground, and yeah, seeing where it goes. But broadly, I think neither the market-based or the regulation-based solution can be the solution alone. Probably both are part of the solution. And I think maybe another way to think about it is that there's a third pillar, where the pillars are the market-based solutions, the state-based or like regulation-based solutions, and the other, which are like domain-specific, almost more like engineered systems, where we're like composing things together to be fit for purpose in a relatively specific organizational or institutional context, in the event that it's not an organization per se, but a collection of strategies, norms, and other activities that give birth to a particular set of dynamics.
I have a response, but I also want to hear from Jonathan. So Jonathan.
Brief question, I think. So I started a garden a couple years ago around a wild strawberry plant that started growing in my yard. It went well for like 2-3 years, and then it became so overburdened and just kind of unintentional that the best solution was to rip out the entire garden, knowing now what I wanted to do with this new gardening sort of vision, and start it from the bottom up with intention from the beginning. So I'm hoping that that translates into the question of how much of this sort of conversation of regulation versus technology can be solved, and Z sort of alluded to this, by just restructuring the architecture of the digital world with a little more intention than what we are now dealing with, which is like, hey, we discovered how to do bits in a digital realm and we ended up where we are now. It's not really fully intentional.
So, I mean, you're asking one of the most profound questions in kind of institutional design as I see it. And this is the constant tug of war in my own head between an ideal or optimal world I might be able to envision. And the way I put it to my students is the world that you would bet your grandmother's pension on. And so my deep concern, and this was actually triggered by some of Z's remarks, is who are some of the parties that are often most eager to have supposedly, wholesome and heartfelt conversations with the regulators? The incumbents that already enjoy massive market power. Because boy, can they afford compliance of certain kinds that any potential entrant or competitor to them would crush them. And so my concern, though, is if we uproot the entire way we create data, is that within the Overton window of possible policy or economic change? So given the amount of capital mustered behind you pick your market power engorged whipping boy, which is to say, whether it be OpenAI, whether it be Meta, whether it be Google, whether it be Amazon, to me, they exist. And so that's not a normative statement, that's a descriptive statement. And so my deep concern is our remedies have to be possible. Otherwise, we're having a purely academic discussion. And so I share, that's not to say I disagree with you, which is if we could start building from floor zero, I think we know enough now to do a lot of things differently. But what floor can we plausibly rip things down to? I'm not sure it's zero, is I guess my rejoinder to your very apt question.
So I think, though, this goes back to your point about conflict in governance, and also something we've discussed at great length, which is path dependency and sort of non-ergodicity, which is bluntly your immediate admissible action space, that which you could realistically change in the current technical, economic, and political environment is a relatively small subset of the things that you might imagine if you redesigned from scratch. So rather than creating the false dichotomy between the kind of determinism of the path we're stuck on and the imagination of an alternative that starts over from scratch, you have to do a different kind of modeling. And that modeling involves benchmarking the current landscape, understanding the sort of available moves in the various economic, political, and technical regimes and their effects on each other, and then basically, more strategically identify interventions. And in a lot of ways, I think that is possible and it is happening. And, if we go back to the superset example, that's basically been the story of our experiences. Like, we started off with something that was at least imagined as being blue sky, and that we were going to make a new thing from scratch, and quickly realized that there were a ton of constraints that we hadn't accounted for. And then we optimized in response to the observation of those constraints and continued to iteratively pursue the stated purpose of the purpose trust. But where the the path that we ended up taking was born out kind of in response to just like feeling and probing all of those modalities. Again, some of which were legal. Just getting a bank account was hard. Relationships, as with auditors, as with corporations that were actually interested in having fair data practices, and so on and so forth. It took us like probably I want to say like almost 2 years just to get to a point where we had an operating knowledge of the landscape that we were in, and then we were constraining our choices to things that were within those admissible action sets, and moving forward, again, optimizing pursuant to the mission of the org, but rather than in a kind of fantasy, imagine if we could rebuild it way, in a, conditioned on what moves were realistically available in the technical, political, and economic landscape we were actually in.
Yeah. And two very, very small points that kind of put specific explanatory gloss on what Z was just referencing. The circuit breaker function is deliberately modeled off of a union's general strike as against a corporation. And we thought maybe we want a data union, until our lawyers were like, please don't ever speak that term again. Being subject to the NLRB's scrutiny is something that you never want to invite if you can ever avoid it. And so whatever you do, don't call it a union. The second was, it took us longer to get a bank account, a commercial bank account with a nationally chartered bank in the US than it did to design and charter the entire trust in the jurisdiction that it was assembled in. The bank was like, we don't need your business per se. We'll take it if we decide we think you're not a regulatory risk. But that took us, well over a year just to get a bank account. And that was a lot of back and forth with their compliance team.
But that's a really concrete example of your point about incumbents. So the idea that you're doing a new thing and not a thing that already exists immediately produces that scrutiny. They were just basically like, are you this list of things? Well, if you're not on this list of things that already exist, then you got to go through the crazy anal, long-winded thing, and then maybe we'll say yes. And the alternative is to collapse back into a thing that already exists. And so it's a direct kind of let's call it cost of innovation in this environment, where the choices were quite literally between bearing those costs and not doing the thing we had designed, right? Like, he was like, you designed a novel mechanism, then fine, go through this battery of pushback.
I would just reframe it. Instead of a cost of innovation, it's a method for preservation, because it's them who's creating it, and they don't. It's almost like a filter's created to make sure that over the course of 2 years, you're almost defeated enough that you don't have the original idea of, hey, let's build something new.
You're 100% right, John. The thing is the duality of those two things. And I think this goes back to the challenge that's late, like here. Like, I'm not saying they shouldn't have done it per se. I was referring to it as proof of paperwork. Quite literally, we had to do proof of work for the right to write our transaction, the existence of our thing. And they were like, no, like, you got to mine a block. It was just a proof of paperwork.
I had to physically collect the hand notarized copies from all of the trustees. And by the time I finally got them collated at my residence, the bank legitimately responded saying, oh, hey, hold on for a moment. We've changed all of our compliance processes. And then came back and were like, we don't actually need your notarized forms. And it was like, That took like almost 3 months to assemble all of that information from the geographically disparate trustees, including when they happen to be in the US, because that would have led to a deeper issue. That being said, I do want to, path dependence is both a beast because of the incumbency protecting mechanisms that are definitely present, including regulatory capture, to which I already alluded. But there are also, I view it as like more benign when it comes to intent, path dependent forces that really shouldn't be belittled when it comes to how hard it is to provoke beneficial change. Somebody at a pop-up village said, I want you to advise me on this new investment vehicle, which caps the upside that investors can take and requires them to cycle it back into community and other public goods or basic research purposes, because there's an asymmetry in terms of funding stuff that's lucrative and, more important, foundational research gets left aside. And I was like, let me shortcut for you why this may be harder than you think. But if your investors are, and say they're just private equity, VC, angels, people with large piles of money that are not constrained by, you know, public secondary markets trading requirements, let's say that's your group, and let's posit that they're located in 7 different jurisdictions. I'm like, you have just created an investment vehicle that's not only novel on its face, but is likely to provoke conflict. As the outsized returns increase, the potential for arguing over whether this provision of the sharing applies to those outside returns only increases, like at a minimum linearly and possibly exponentially above a certain amount of return. And I was like, in order for any of these VCs to fund you, their lawyers need to do due diligence on your novel investment vehicle. And every single one of their lawyers is going to say, I've never considered this before. And it might involve litigation across 5 jurisdictions over a vehicle that has never been treated in my jurisdiction, let alone any of those jurisdictions. And so for some of the advice we got for Superset, we had to waive the fact that it was legal advice, because past a certain point of uncertainty, people that are professionally licensed to give legal advice can't give it. If they're uncertain enough, or they're just like, this is me speculating along a novel enough institutional frontier, they're like, at some point, my bar prevents me from speaking to you in the context of providing legal advice. And we're like, but can you just advise us, please? That's like what we're paying you for. And they're like, not professionally. And it's like, well, how about we don't call it legal advice? And in some contexts, they're willing to do that, but that is just one tiny patch on the deeper problem, where the more novel the institutional arrangement, the harder you're going to get the harder it will be to get legal sign off in order to do the thing. And that was a big issue for us with Superset.
I think, but that's important to note that it starts to break down, not even at the level of like legal outcomes. You're like, even just getting advice gets hard. The moment that you're like, I'm trying something new and different, like maybe I don't think the institutional landscape of the world, and in particular the one wrought by our current internet age data economy, is great. Let's try a different thing. And then basically the entire system is got layers and layers of rejection mechanisms, all the way down to having to find lawyers who are willing to say, look, we'll give you non-legal advice about this as experts, but not as, or not even as professionals in some cases. And you're like, wait, what's going on? You're like, actually, that makes sense from their perspective. But on the other hand, who else should you be asking for the advice that you then use to design, test, and validate novel mechanisms designed to try to create corrections in the incentive landscape vis-a-vis the use and, in some cases, abuse of data?
No, exactly. I can keep going for another 4 minutes if there's other questions. I definitely apologize for talking so damn long. Somebody should have cut me off. But that's
If
often
there's no questions, we can logistics this thing out. So first of all, I think we have to have an economics of change call at some point, because this is a little separated from economics of data, but this is a wonderful conversation.
And
yeah,
my real quick response to that is that if you talk to an economic historian or an institutional economist, they're like, change is what you have to analyze. It's central to understanding difference in outcomes over time is the rate and form of change that a economy, that an institutional set, guess what? Those aren't actually separable, but those things, and so the Doug North image I had, his canonical book is Institutions and Institutional Change and Economic Performance. And so fundamentally, I love that you're bringing that up. And it's a pretty central theme to a lot of the works in the Institutions and Complexity Theory volume that I just finished editing at the end of this summer. And so you're spot on, and I would attend, although I'm certainly not I've consumed far more of your airtime than I was allotted. So I'd probably politely listen as opposed to go on a 50-minute screed.
It's a great screed, to be fair. Are there any other last thoughts here? All right, then we will get this recording up, and we'll meet again in December. Z, do you have just a second to stick around after the recording?
Sure.
I want to run something by you.
Cool. And hey, thank you, Rick, and thank you everybody for attending today. This was awesome. And I mean, it's always fun to just kind of come in here and jam and spread knowledge and hang out.
Awesome. Thank you.
Where's the recording button? Stop recording.